going to talk to you today about medical device security. It's going to somewhat blend into security of cyber physical systems, things that touch the real world. And we'll just kind of like, if you haven't felt this way in this, this is kind of how the security world tends to kind of see this. And so if you're ready, we'll set off. So as I talked a little bit about, I started my world in the safety critical world. So I worked at Honeywell's corporate research center. So we were a centralized research center for all of Honeywell back at the day when Honeywell was a control systems focused company. So everything we touched manipulated the real world. Thermostats, control systems for oil refineries. I focused mine in space and aerospace and ended up working quite a bit in fault-tolerant architectures. I got to spend quite a bit of fun time working on the flight deck for the Boeing 777. Then I got recruited and pulled into the device world, ostensibly as a safety person. I worked on the design of a fault-tolerant backup pacemaker defibrillator that's in all of our devices. So that's where my patent stuff comes from in the device world. And then I ended up working and starting to get pulled into the security space as I ended up becoming the system lead for the system that we use to monitor patients when they're sleeping in their bed at night and putting long-range radios to pick the data up while they're sleeping. Norma has a bedside stand next to her, so our Latitude patient management system monitors her amongst about 400,000 or 500,000 others that are currently on that system. So I evolved to become the focal point for product security. Then I went away, as I said, about 3.5 years at a small R&D company, did DHS and Army telemedicine work where I pulled in medical device security, government research contracts, worked on cyber resilience for DARPA. During all this period of time, AMI is the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. They are a standards and education body for the medical device, interacting with the parts of hospitals that are fielding and managing the medical devices in there. So I co-chaired a device security working group, and one of their best sellers was the guidance we have on how do you do security for medical devices. And then a little over 2 years ago, I got pulled back into Boston Scientific to drive a company-wide program on medical device security. So that's what I do now. A couple of examples, because I realized coming down here, the only thing you may know about Boston Scientific is we must be from Boston, which is what a lot of the marketing people keep asking, do I want to come down to a lunch in downtown Boston? And I'm from Minneapolis. We have more employees in the Twin Cities area than we do in Minneapolis. But again, we're about just coming up on a $10 billion company. We do about 10% of that goes into R&D. And so we have about 30 million patients a year. We also have a huge focus on being a green company. So we touch 130 countries, 132,000 employees, very much a global business. This is the kind of areas as medical devices that we focus on. The way I tend to describe Boston Scientific is we got two parts of the company. We got plumbers and we got electricians. And the plumbers are really good at making long, skinny things that can be slid inside the body to go and treat things remotely with minimally invasive capability. So it's heart stents, putting a stent in the heart that goes in through the leg or through that point of view. And we're more and more delivering energy remotely through lasers, laser fibers that go in to treat kidney stones or cancer. We will do ablation for cardiac ablation to get rid of arrhythmias or ablation of other locations. So we're getting more and more broad in that. But in general, and then the electricians are the implantable devices that we do in terms of deep brain stimulation, spinal cord stimulation, heart stimulation, subcutaneous heart. So this is kind of a mixture of more in mapping arrhythmias and how do you do 3D mapping of hearts. So again, everything we're touching is either treating patients either actively while they're ambulatory by having it in their body during a procedure, or diagnosing and providing information to help physicians make accurate diagnosis. So we touch the human. I just wanted to make sure that people understood a little background of Brian and myself. So this is Brian at his 4th birthday, and you'll notice the space shuttle on here and his Lego space shuttle there. So I took this picture back in that time. Now, about a year later, when I was at Honeywell, I got to be over this other side. I took the picture on the side. That's the real space shuttle. That's the Space Shuttle Challenger being serviced in the orbital processing facility About a year and a half after this was taken was when Challenger blew up on launch in '86. So this is kind of, but we ended up resonating early on because we were both into space shuttles. So let me talk a little bit about, you're welcome, Brian. I showed Maggie this yesterday, so she already knew it was coming. I said, don't tell Brian. But and that is not the most embarrassing picture I could have gotten. I was nice. It wasn't embarrassing at all. It was pretty damn cute. Anyway, we talk a little bit about the threat environment and healthcare. I am sure if you read the security literature, you read the public literature, you're going to hear all the stuff going on related to healthcare and how insecure it is. Here, mostly, we have not seen targeted attacks against the healthcare environment. Somebody's written custom code to go after. So a lot of the warnings of things, even the situation with Medtronic that happened late last week, was really about researchers looking at what could be potentially done if somebody were to field something to initially attack these. Mostly what we've gotten has been what you call drive-by exploitation. Awful lot of medical devices, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, tend to go with commercial off-the-shelf software, Windows operating systems, things that are easy to build, and as a result they share the vulnerabilities of those underlying platforms. And so something put out to exploit those vulnerabilities will catch a healthcare device because of the shared infrastructure, not because the developers wanted to attack medical devices in the environment. There had been some ransomware that were deployed to hospitals on EHR that looked like it may have been targeted phishing attacks against the hospital, but the underlying malware that they were using in the phishing attack was not built to attack an EHR system or something that was uniquely found in the healthcare environment. It was designed using garden variety kinds of things. So again, we haven't seen that, but a lot of healthcare has been affected by NotPetya, WannaCry, Conficker. I put the NT symbol up here because we'll talk a little bit about how long devices that are cyber physical systems and medical devices get used, and that tension between what software you use at their base versus how long they're going to be used in the system. Yep, the other left click. Two primary threat actors, and a lot of the thought you go through in terms of threat modeling in a world is to think, what are the threat actors? What are their capabilities? What kinds of things do I need to worry about? So nation states, and 5 years ago, everyone would say, well, you can't tolerate, if a nation state decides to come after you, you're toast, so I don't worry about them in my threat model. Well, what we've seen in both NotPetya and WannaCry in 2017 was they were North Korea and Russian attacks. And they weren't, again, necessarily deployed against healthcare, but they used exploits that caught them. So again, what nation states tend to be after is either staging capabilities to potentially use in the future if a cyber war broke out, or a lot of it is data information gathering. They're trying to find out, if they can find out health information that's embarrassing about somebody that has a sensitive position that could be used to blackmail, or so they're collecting lots of data, so they're sweeping up massive amounts and filtering through for that kind of intelligence, but they have a lot of capabilities. And then cyber criminals has been the other area, which is people looking to make money. So their output of it is, what can I sell? So whether it's credit card information, whether it's healthcare records, whether it's insurance information, or is it ransomware that can cause people to pay money to get back a resource that is important to them. And certainly in the healthcare business, the health records are a prime potential target for cybercrime because today's modern hospital runs on the electronic systems that keep it going. And to take out the EHR can cripple a hospital. And we've seen some examples of hospitals being down or in reduced mode for a week while they are dealing with their backups. So another lesson in the security operations rule is there is, and I don't have this on a slide, but there is a term called Schrodinger's backup, and Schrodinger's backup is basically the any backup that has not been tested for recovery does not exist. If you haven't actually checked. So a lot of hospitals were running on Schrodinger's backup and found the ability to go roll back was not nearly as easy as they thought it was. So, but what we're seeing is a blending of these threats. What you're seeing in Russia is cyber criminals that the government looks the other way, or may hire them for one-time jobs as long as what they're doing doesn't impact the Russian government or their infrastructures, but elsewhere. In China, you're finding people who work for hacking groups for the government, who then on the side will freelance, given the tools and things that they already have access to through their job, to do cybercrime work that they might do to make additional income. So we're seeing, this is probably within the next couple of years in the healthcare environment, the thing we're worrying about and watching the most. Unfortunately, they're the most sophisticated. Yep, again, the other left hand. Hacktivists, we've seen a couple of incidents. There was a child custody case at Boston Children's 4 years ago, and the group Anonymous did a denial of service attack against the public website of Boston Children's in order to kind of be as a protest against this custody issue of this sick child, until people in various positions said, you know, Anonymous, you're talking about the health of kids. And they went, oops, and they pulled back their DDoS attack. But still, script kiddies are, you know, people mostly in this world, the researchers that you see that post things on devices don't post scripts to make it easy for people to replicate it. They try to contact the FDA and the companies to fix it with painting the broad picture of what could be done, but not posting the code to make it done easily. Disgruntled employees, and my recommendation always on disgruntled employees is try your best to keep them gruntled. And just plain old user error. And user error can even be in the form of social engineering and being aware of what kind of information. So there's a lot of companies out there that will do common administrative username and passwords for their equipment. And I think I'll use the example here in some hacks. Mayo Clinic hired some researchers to come in and just see how their devices would behave. And one of the things that surprised Mayo was these researchers used social engineering to call up the support lines of companies and pretend they're docs and get the companies to give up, you know, information like the passwords and things they needed to access it, because nobody would pretend to be a doc, would they? So again, learning lessons for the industry about how those kind of things can be done. I'm going to touch briefly, I got kind of a potpourri of topics to get you through today to get you a picture of this. And this is you know, I was laughing with Brian this weekend because the hand soap in his guest bathroom was a brand called Method, and the scent or whatever was called Waterfall. And so I said, oh, do you have a Method Agile? And so that's what he's had to grow up with, and may explain a little bit about why he is the way he is. But anyway, he said many of the students nowadays probably have only heard of Agile and haven't necessarily heard of the waterfall model. This is a classic waterfall model where phases kind of, you do one, complete it, move it to the next. Much of the regulated world, and I'm not saying, when I say regulated, it's not just the medical device world, though this is from FDA quality system regulation documentation. But whether you're in aviation or nuclear reactors or that, tend to characterize the elements in a waterfall mode without saying that your development and design processes necessarily in here have to follow a period. So, full Big Bang and you don't start testing until you have the whole thing together. But kind of the idea in this one is, and I wanted to bring this because as you see all the stories about what's going on in the security world, well, the next step is how do you patch them? And what is the expectation? Why is it that device manufacturers aren't just patching things in 24 hours like some hospitals ask us to do? And it really is, this two steps is we talk about verification, validation, and this kind of just diagrammatically shows that verification is proving that what you built meets what you said you were going to build. Validation is, does the end system meet what the customer needed? So a physician, so often in validation exercises, if it's a surgical device, we will go through practice surgeries on a dummy and observe whether or not a trained physician doing it actually achieves what they were supposed to. That's validation. Verification is going and verifying requirements, design specifications. Does this thing respond in this particular period of time? So everything that's captured in terms of requirements we've demonstrated is actually doing what it's supposed to. And the reason that I kind of pointed that out, I think I talk a little bit, is when we talk about updates, is because we have these old devices, because we still have NT, what has been traditional in the regulated marketplace is, the reality is we're really good at safety. And we test the heck out of systems and are pretty convinced that they're safe. And traditionally, we update software in a medical device only when something happens in our experience in the field that has demonstrated that our safety analysis is wrong. There's a safety issue that we need to address that we didn't know of. That is infrequent, thank goodness. But as a result, we tend to not necessarily have the mechanisms staged for rapid re-verification. Validation doesn't necessarily change, because if I'm doing a vulnerability patch, I'm not changing the correct function of the device. I am removing incorrect functionality. A buffer overflow that's sitting in a library that's now been patched by Microsoft, you never want that buffer overflow to be used for wrong purpose. So if I add code that now bounce checks the buffer and it doesn't have a buffer overflow, all of the normal cases should still operate in the same way. So we don't need to revalidate. But so essentially, you need to do this. FDA is really trying to get out of the way and not be blamed as the molasses slowing down updates. So they've made some real clear expectation about situations where we as manufacturers can make updates and go to the field without asking FDA's permission in advance. They still expect that validation to be done. And I think the thing that industry is wrestling with when you hear slow response is, because we only did validation and verification infrequently, the processes to do them may not be terribly efficient. I would assume that in some of your classes related to Agile, you've talked about things like continuous testing, things where you can have that. So building these systems so that you can make these kinds of patch and updates and rapidly know that you have not broken verification tests is an important thing the medical device and other regulated world needs to learn, so that we can do those kinds of updates quickly. But that's a lot of the reason why you hear foot dragging is many of those. I know that in the case of our implanted device, like Norma has, the test for the implant, to go through all of our tests, is a calendar time of a team. I don't know how many people will be on the team, of on the order of 3 months to complete, just to run the tests, because of all the safety tests. So again, not all of those tests need to be done if you do a networking thing. That said, implants tend to be bare metal devices. There's no windows or anything. They're code straight on metal. So we're not typically having vulnerabilities come about because Microsoft issued a patch. But that's understanding that. So I'm going to give you a quick, so it's 1:40 is 1:50? Well, hour and a half.
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock, okay. I just wanted to make sure I'm gauging. And if there's questions, do feel free to jump in with things if you need. I can manage that. So if you've seen the history of hacks, some of the stuff, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what has hit the medical device world. In 2008 was kind of the watershed event. A team at the time from UMass Amherst and University of Washington published got a paper accepted into IEEE Security and Privacy's annual conference. And it was in May 2008. In March of 2008, the agenda got announced, and a blogger person saw it, started blogging about the fact that this topic was about hacking defibrillators. And shortly thereafter, a couple of small publications, I believe it was New York Times and Wall Street Journal, picked it up and were looking to do stories on it, and it blew up. They basically demonstrated that they were given an old Medtronic device that had been explanted out of a patient, so had limited battery life left. That wasn't an issue in their research. But devices, they always talk about, well, but devices now are wireless. The pacemakers and defibrillators have been wireless since the early 70s, because the absence of wireless means you got to physically touch the device under the skin. And rarely, back in the 60s, the early pacemakers had one setting. You could change the pacing rate, and that was done with a screwdriver. So if you wanted to do it after it was implanted, you had to locally anesthetize and secure that and make a little cut and go in and catch a screwdriver with that and literally change the pacing rate physically by turning a port on the device. You really don't want to do that very often. So these systems have been near-field inductive. I'm an electrical engineer by training, so that basically means you have two coils of wire that are planarly located over each other, and a magnetic field is generated through the coils and you communicate with them. They have to be within about an inch of the skin for that link to happen. And that is what they hacked and did a classic, well, you know, RF can be made to operate from a distance, but this is a 1/r³ drop off with energy, if you remember your physics class. So 1 over, you know, the cube distance. Standard RF protocols up in RF range where you're using more electromagnetic waves in terms of that is 1/r² in energy drop. So it's a lot easier to make a high frequency RF system work from a long distance than it is an inductive. So I thought that was always flaws in the research. They really didn't show how they can make a attack, which they demonstrated from 1 inch away with a software radio, work from any practical distance. And the real risk was in these long range RF links, which had just started emerging on the market, but weren't in the device they had. Later, they said they had demonstrated the same attack using the long-range RF link, and last week's reports shows similar behaviors in their long-range RF link today. Yeah, Brian. Oh, we had a question over here. Thank you.
Oh, is the is the frequency for communication standardized?
Good question. Most device manufacturers, us different initially, went to a 405 megahertz band called the Medical Information Communication System, MICS, MIX or MICS, depending on whether you're from here or there. You say potato. We used an ISM band initially up in the 900 megahertz range, and ultimately because there were certain countries that would not approve those higher frequency bands, we also joined the 405. So pretty much everyone is at 405 megahertz. The evolution in the industry is toward low energy Bluetooth. So looking at security protocols on top of standard Bluetooth, the energy level of Bluetooth is starting. The main issue of these is a pacemaker is designed to last off of the battery that's inside the sealed can in a little thing for 10 years. So the energy level you can put into telemetry is very limited, or you shorten that life cycle down. And the infection risk, when you replace the battery, you replace the whole device. And the infection risk for a replacement is on the order of 2%. They get a nasty infection. And so long life really has some overall benefits to the patient. So it really, when they talk about, you know, encryption, full-time encryption like last week takes battery energy, there really is a battery trade-off going on, that if you shorten a 10-year device down to a 6-year device and you look across, you know, 100,000 patients, how many infections happen because I did that many more replacements. So it's not dealt with lightly, but yeah, anyway, 4 or 5 megahertz is an international frequency that has been standardized.
Is there a reason why they're not using microwave frequencies?
A lot of it tends to be depth of the skin. There's certain attenuation that happens with fat tissues and moisture. So getting frequencies that can penetrate into the skin. And one of the things that we've actually was interesting learning, we learned on a mechanical problem, is there is certain parts of the world where for aesthetic purposes they will implant the device under the first layer of muscle rather than in the fatty tissue so that it hides it more, which puts it deeper underneath more tissue so you have more energy loss in talking to it. It also means when it's under the muscle that the can gets twisted every time you do this, and that sets some requirements for device stiffness that had to tolerate that kind of an implant approach. So, good questions. So anyway, that was the first one. And I will just make a brief point that wasn't in the slides because we try to avoid too much waving our thing, but we put our first RF protocol long-range devices out starting in 2005 in Europe, 2006 in the United States, and they didn't have these security issues. It's good to be paranoid. The next line of attacks happened in 2011. A researcher by the name of Jay Radcliffe, who himself was a diabetic and wearing an insulin pump, a wearable insulin pump, decided, gee, is my own pump hackable? And he discovered it was, and presented it at Black Hat in August 2001, and everything kind of exploded related to that as an issue. And if you ever have a chance to dig into Jay Radcliffe's, the slides and things that he did and some of the presentations on it, it's fascinating the persistence he did. He ended up social engineering, figuring out what the chip vendor, it was TI, I believe, was a chip vendor that was used for some of the internal electronics. And he social engineered TI to get specs and manuals on the processors so he could kind of learn how they worked. So it's like you kind of think, oh, well, this is all too hard, until you see, well, what happens when somebody bird dogs and decides, if they decide to focus on you, every system has vulnerabilities. So it's, to a certain extent, your first goal in implementing a secure system is to make sure that all of the standard things they're going to try first don't work, because they will try all the standard things. And depending on how many systems they have in their potential field to try, if the simple things don't work on yours, they may move on. Now, if somebody has a particular reason, this guy was wearing a Medtronic device, he had a very particular reason to understand Medtronic. You know, somebody happens to grab onto a specific system and beat on it, it's a deeper issue about how strong it needs to be to make sure they don't find it. But anyway, Jay worked for us for a while, so I've gotten to know Jay very well. Good guy. Very well intentioned in terms of it was personal to try to improve the industry kind of thing, which is what I found about a lot of the researchers that are out there. Barnaby Jack was a very famous researcher. Type in Barnaby Jack if you want to see his most dramatic thing that got to hit the news waves was at one of the DEF CON or Black Hat conferences. He had an ATM machine on stage and hacked into it and had it spitting out 20s onto the floor, which was, so he was a showman. In that regard, he was with McAfee at the time, and he demonstrated Jay Radcliffe's hack required him to know the model serial number in order to affect it. He figured out how to extract the model serial number from the device and use it to connect, and from 100 yards away demonstrated to a clear dummy with clear fluid inside and the insulin in the pump being dyed blue so it would be dramatic, showed from a long distance away getting the device to dump all of its insulin at once. So again, showman combined with it. So it started, the whole industry starting to take this much more seriously as they started getting, and again, it's always been this love-hate relationship between the people being hacked and the researchers hacking them, which is the researchers' stock and trade can be reputation, which allows them to charge higher rates for their consulting services, gives them cred within their industry, but they can be very well-meaning, and they always feel like they approach manufacturers and they get strong-armed. Or the comment that researchers say is they hate it when they contact a company and the person who returns their call is a lawyer. They don't feel like they're being listened to rather than having a technical person call. So again, depending on which side of the world you might end up in, if you're working in security research, just be willing to listen and listen to them and try to direct their interest in a way that is productive for all, because that in the end largely is what they're intending to. Billy Rios, who's another big name in this area, has been a prolific hacker in both the medical device space, but if you've read any stories about NASA and the Department of Defense funding some hack work on a NASA 757 on the ground and some of the success that was happened that's been still classified, Billy was on the team that hacked the airplane as well. Anyway, they started looking at devices that were using hard-coded passwords. And if they use hard-coded passwords and you compile them into your code, a pass-through strings and grepping for certain alpha character, grepping for things like password or other things in there, it easily uncovers inside binary code where what the password is that's been stored, compiled into the code. So there's a lot of updated software that's put out by manufacturers on their websites. So they started going and downloading and doing these. They said they stopped when they hit 300 and kind of go, who do we tell? And they told the FDA and ICS CERT. So if you've talked about organizations, so US CERT, CERTs are Computer Emergency Response Teams, and they are government-funded groups that coordinate the reporting of vulnerabilities and the response by those responsible for the software to patches getting issued. So if you see a CVE number next to a vulnerability reported, those CVEs are monitored by MITRE, are managed by MITRE, which is funded by the government, and US CERT is the organization that tends to have the website that talks about them. ICS CERT came under Department of Homeland Security, and ICS stands for Industrial Control Systems, and so it was initially created for vulnerabilities around systems that manufacture chemicals and other things where if they go wrong, you could have a Bhopal or other kind of disaster on your hands. So ICS CERT publishes the things related to that. ICS CERT was given the responsibility to pick up medical devices in healthcare because of its relationship to Internet of Things, of cyber-physical systems. They didn't change the name from ICS, but if you go to the ICS CERT site and look at their alert list, you'll see a mix of Siemens and Honeywell and Rockwell and things related to automation systems, and Medtronic and Philips and Boston Scientific and BD for medical devices. So they're the people that kind of do it. So they basically went to the FDA and ICS CERT, which issued an alert, and the FDA issued guidance on what they needed that day. It was kind of a force multiplier to get the industry to act. This is kind of a slide used. This is not just kind of a slide. This is a slide used by Mayo Clinic after I'd referred to earlier about them having people in and the social engineering surprise that they had. They had, did they say 45 devices up here that they looked at? Yes, for 5 days. They didn't put this on the slide, but from one of the researchers that I know that was in the group doing this, my understanding is the approximate number of devices of those 45 that they were able to successfully hack into and break. If I remember right, it was 45, that was it. Yeah, it was. So none of them were invulnerable. So the other one that happened was back in 2015, again, in Billy Rios again. Billy Rios had grabbed on, and he had shown a ability for a particular Hospira pump to be accessed from outside the hospital. So it's medical infusion pumps sit on hospital networks to get access to a drug library. So there is a library that defines drug types and what their maximum and minimum dosage rate can be. And it's used as part of when you put an IV bag up on a pump next to a patient, that they pair up and make sure that it's supposed to be a safety check. But there's a locally hosted server that the drug library can be tuned by the physician staff of that hospital. So in order to get the latest drug library, the pumps are on our network to allow them to download the drug library. And so they found that between those manipulations and its presence on it, they were able to make infusion pumps change their flow rate from outside a hospital. So it becomes all of a sudden a potential global attack. So the FDA strongly encourages you just stop using those pumps. So when the regulator basically starts telling all your customers to stop using your equipment, that's not a good thing. I will note, again, in the issue of being taped and that, Hospira was I believe purchased or acquired by a company called ICU Medical, who has been very adamant about revamping their product line. There was a biohacking village at last year's DEF CON, and there was specific note was there was new devices produced by ICU Medical that have been much better than what was being done back then. So again, it's a lesson where being whacked over the head in public by your regulator forced behavior to change. Just a couple more examples, and then we'll move on to what do you do about this. Trinity Health, they were hit by WannaCry. If you remember right, WannaCry was ostensibly a ransomware that was actually a lockerware. And they had 2,500 devices. The interesting thing that they noted, that was the point of the conference that the CISO from Trinity was talking about, was this was a variant that hit 2 weeks after the original WannaCry variant. If you remember, the original WannaCry variant had a kill switch built in, and there was a researcher out of the UK that figured that out by reverse engineering some of its behavior. And that kill switch was whether or not a particular IP address or a particular domain name would resolve on the DNS to an IP address. So essentially, they would check a domain name, run it through DNS, and if it came back there was nothing there, it would continue to do its hack. If it responded back with an IP address, then it would say, okay, kill switch is active. So this kid went out and quickly registered the domain for this particular string, DNS string, and all of the WannaCry devices stopped because they saw it. I believe he's still being retained here in the United States because he was at Black Hat then a year or so later, and he was wanted for some other hacking he had done in the past, and so he was arrested by the US government shortly after leaving Black Hat. So I follow him on Twitter. He's an interesting person. Anyway, this was one where the kill switch had been deployed without the kill switch, and their thing was, okay, they quick go to their manufacturers, say, what are you going to do? Well, in 2 weeks, to my previous comment about verification validation, how all that process is, it was a surprise to them, but no surprise if you understand the industry, that the device manufacturers hadn't necessarily put that patch on all of their devices. Because this, if you remember, WannaCry exploited Eternal Blue, which was a NSA hack that had been hacked by the Russians, had been exposed by the, what was the hacking group that was out there trying to sell them on the dark web, and then finally they exposed them. Microsoft had patched these about 2 months earlier, which says, though Microsoft has never acknowledged it, that once the NSA realized that their hacks had been stolen, they had gone to Microsoft and told them what they had broken so that Microsoft could work on patches, so that before they got out in the wild there would be patches. So, but reality is a lot of systems on the internet had not had the March patch when the May breakout happened. And much less, there was, when I heard this, it was 5 months after this, and they said they still had 1/3 of their devices that weren't patched. So it's a real challenge for operators of these kinds of networks, of how you manage networks of devices that are critical for life care. Norma, you are going to sleep tonight, okay, aren't you? You're going to sleep okay tonight. I always talk with, when we talk around family things, she always gets, you know, I always want to make sure I'm not making you too nervous, but we're getting home late tonight, so. Nuance Healthcare, if you've ever used Dragon Dictation or familiar, Nuance makes Dragon Dictation. They have a vertical for healthcare, and they had about 60% of the US hospitals signed up for their service. It's a transcription service used during surgery so that physicians and things can be narrating what they're doing and finding and having it transcribed so they can just edit, transcribe notes rather than after it having to sit down and type or deal with or transcribe or dictate all of what they remembered having happened. Well, NotPetya was in June of that year, and that was Wiperware. If you remember, that's the thing distributed through Ukraine. It was essentially the TurboTax equivalent in Ukraine for filing taxes for the Ukrainian government. And the update server, this was a supply chain attack. So if you read yesterday about anything, depending on how much you're following cybersecurity like I am, ASUS was reported yesterday as having had a supply chain attack where their update server had been corrupted and was serving bad updates. Well, this is an example where the software vendor in Ukraine for this software had an automatic update server. It was corrupted and issued NotPetya into it, which got distributed. So all around the world, NotPetya was one that hit Nuance, and they had to go down and rapidly shut down the company. And the comment of the size of this company that was at this conference was, We're not talking about separating yourself from the internet. We're talking about shutting your network, internal network down, because it was going laterally from computer to computer inside once it had got it. It was not the outside connection. That was already done. The root cause of, like, I remember, was it Nuance or was Merck was also hit by it? And one of them, the root cause they realized was why they got hit and some of their competitors didn't was it used credentials that had been left on the computer that got infected and used them as network credentials to try to log in. They were unlucky that one of the last people that had logged in to the computer that got infected had administrative credentials. So their NotPetya variant happened to be walking around the company network with administrator level credentials, which caused it to go. Anyway, they had to shut down. Their phones were all IP phones. Their email was all server. Their phone numbers for whoever everyone was they needed to contact were in Outlook. So lessons on here, what they said was, have other means of knowing the cell numbers and things you do of all your key people so you can actually assemble teams to recover, because you don't realize how dependent you are on your network until it gets shut down. They ended up scrapping out 6,000 computers, and they were offline for 6 weeks. I think it was more than $1 billion worth of cost. The amazing thing, which I've never heard a good root cause presentation for, they were evolving to a system where the transcription and everything was flowing through a cloud-based service. So the NotPetya malware did not flow through the cloud links and infect their customers. It may have been through the administrative credentials that ended up being the block, but had they also infected 60% of the hospitals through those links, it would have been a huge liability and safety issue if to have that many hospitals in the US all impacted simultaneously. So Mayo Clinic, one of the leading places in terms of testing and dealing with it, they have now set minimum requirements of expected. So again, I kind of view these as, well, it's Mayo asking it of the healthcare system. If they're thinking about, if you're designing a system that's going to be dealing with it, what are the kind of basic, when you talk about basic cyber hygiene, keep on a supported OS, push OS updates down. They always talk about antivirus. I really think in Internet of Things stable devices like this, whitelisting is a better approach because it's a little more resilient to things that aren't in your AV solution, and you have lots of challenges. So each hospital may have a different AV solution they're deploying, and as a manufacturer you have to test to make sure the AV engine is working with the different types and AV, so the management of AV is a much bigger thing in trying to deal with than the management of whitelisting along with that. But again, you've received third-party software patches, no default passwords. They want to have it compiled with Mayo Work Account Standards, so they want to be able to ultimately hook in, I think, Mayo's Active Directory in terms of using localized credentials for that. So again, this is kind of their expectation. So again, and they have promulgated this to others. One of the cool things is my colleague in IT that I work with closely, we stole from Mayo, so he knows all that stuff from the inside. So it's good to have him on board. Since then, we've seen Blueborn, which is a Bluetooth vulnerability. We saw various data breaches in Equifax and ransomware. Meltdown Spectre happened early last year, which was a hardware vulnerability. And so if you haven't, the thing that was interesting about Meltdown Spectre is it was a new class of attack. I mean, it's a side channel attack, so if you studied or looked at a side channel, it's the ability to come in through an alternate means to get at that. But it was a side channel attack that was using the caches and the information, trying to speed up modern processors by doing anticipatory execution. And so since then, there have been a few other attacks and vulnerabilities identified that it's like once you point researcher to here's another kind of thing you can think about, boom, boom, and then they start looking at other ones. But so that's the new normal. So that's been the world. I didn't get a lot into, obviously, last week's Medtronic discussion, which may be where questions lie, but yes, those kind of things have been happening as well. And as well as the short sell on St. Jude stock that happened by a financial firm who found vulnerabilities in their systems and decided to short sell the stock and then announced the vulnerabilities to the world as a way to make money, which was as most people in the industry says, it appears to be legal, but also seems really unethical. But that's me. So we're going to talk a little bit about safety and security. So again, I've mentioned the term cyber-physical systems, and that's the broad class of things, whether it's our automotive systems, oil refineries, our hospitals, commercial aircraft, building controls. These are all different things that are interacting with the physical world and touch that. So I think, is my next slide? Okay, the next slide after this will give the demo of it if you haven't seen that one. The US has defined 16 critical infrastructures. And so these are infrastructures for which our economy, our society depends. There's interdependencies between these. So if your communication system goes down, you may have problems with transportation. So it is very, so, but each of these sectors has been assigned to a government group, from Health and Human Services and some of the healthcare environment, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, to look at and understand vulnerabilities in these systems and study how to make these systems more resilient to cybersecurity problems. So they said the healthcare and public health, HPH, is one of the categories for which we've had lots of government help looking at different aspects of that. I will be in San Diego next week at one of their meetings. So let's see. Looks like we don't have an audio option. We can test that ahead of time. There we are. So this is an engine, a motor, that's being cyber attacked. And they were able to let the smoke out just for the cyber attack. So this was a demonstration done to show feasibility. Okay, there, we're back, buzz-free. So again, that was just in the referral kind of in the military world is talking about something going kinetic, and that is, how do I make something move in the physical world? And so here's an example of an engine that was in a backup generator kind of system that they went in basically and hacked into the control software and started resonating it. How many people here have read about, in any detail, the Stuxnet attack that happened? So Stuxnet was done by US and Israeli intelligence, both who've denied that they did anything about it. But if I would strongly recommend, if you want an interesting cybersecurity story, read Countdown to Zero Day by, pardon? Yeah, Countdown to Zero Day by Kim Zetter. Kim writes for Wired magazine and is one of the most cyber savvy writers out there. She also wrote just last week, she was the one that broke, I'd have to go look at my Twitter feed. I, again, follow her on Twitter in terms of some of the other articles she broke. But anyway, she did a real detailed analysis, interviewing a lot of people. Anyway, Stuxnet was an attack on the centrifuges being used to enrich uranium in Iran. And they basically, it was an air-gapped system. There was no connection to the internet. There were PCs inside the facility that were connected to the Siemens controllers that were running the centrifuges in the system. So they were all Siemens industrial control, closed-loop control systems. So they ended up figuring out what was there, building malware, distributing it, as I understand, on flash drives so that people would plug in and get their PCs infected by, hey, free flash drive. The easiest way to bridge an air gap, drop flash drives around. The things you should never do is find a flash drive and put it in your computer. And it infected and crossed over, and this system, when it powered up on the PC, would look over the network to see whether or not Siemens equipment of particular types and configurations were present. And if as I recall, they sought out the system that managed the software that was downloaded into the Siemens controllers, and they ultimately deployed that code. And what it did was it took a 24-hour long snapshot of normal operation and recorded it. And then it started impacting the speed of the centrifuges while playing back the recording. You've all seen in all the spook games where they do the video and they feed the video back so that people can't see in the camera. They did exactly that, but by computer data going back to the control. So the operators in the station saw all normal behavior going on while they were playing with the oscillation speed. And because the centrifuges ran in a room that was mostly pumped down to vacuum, there was nobody there hearing the weirdness in the fact that they were running it up to high speed and slowing it down. And their goal was to essentially break the motors of the centrifuges and have them to need to be replaced, so they were essentially not able to. So that, and the challenge in the world of hacked code is once StuckNet was out, the ability to reverse engineer StuckNet and deploy it in other configurations against other targets is really easy. And one of the things we're seeing is the time between initial identification of malware and when somebody has redeployed it in some other configuration for some other purpose is shortening to as little as 24 hours nowadays. Months. So it was Heartbleed that was an attack against one of the systems, and that was about 1 month from the time it was published to the point where they had seen malware based on Heartbleed. So it keeps getting faster. Back in another couple of people I follow on Twitter, because they continue to do research, but the two researchers back in, this is 2015 as well, yeah, 2015, demonstrated how to hack a Jeep. They went out and showed they could apply brakes, they could do all kinds of things. They hacked into it through the entertainment system, because the entertainment system is on the same internal buses as the systems that affect the accelerator and steering and that type of stuff, so they could hack in through the entertainment systems that have Bluetooth. One thing I would recommend you not put on your vehicle, there's an OBDX port, I believe, that's underneath the dash on them. They use them to read all the status if you go in and they want to find out why do you have this idiot light on, and they can pull the data out. That also is a write port. You can write software and do that. And so there's a bunch of apps that if you want to check your car's performance, you plug in a module that basically is a Bluetooth connection to your phone to an app and basically exposes your car's control system to Bluetooth, which I'm sure it's secured really well. Safety. So Webster's definition of what's safety, it's like a condition of being safe from undergoing or causing hurt. I'll use 14971 here a lot, and in a couple weeks I get to go and at a AMI conference and be on a panel talking about standards, and there's nothing more exciting in the world than talking about standards and rattling their numbers off. But I have slipped down the slippery slope of standards hell, and I can quote standards numbers with the best of them. 14971 is the standard that drives safety analysis for the medical device world. It's an ISO standard used by both Europe and recognized by the FDA as the way to do it. And their definition is safety is freedom from unacceptable risk. Now security, you talk about state of free of danger or the state of being protected or safe from harm. So there's some intertwining there in terms of the harm. It roots down in dependability, and I know I sent this to Brian to put up in your class. It really is a seminal paper if you're into this sort of thing, but it is really a taxonomy that looks at how you define aspects of dependability from its availability. Is the system available and can you do correct work? Is it reliable? Does it do the right thing across the period of time? Is it safe? How many people are Marathon Man fans? Go back and watch your old movies, because there's a dentist scene in there where the guy keeps coming at Dustin Hoffman with a drill. He keeps asking, "Is it safe?" It's one of my favorite scenes. Having a daughter that's a dentist, I always kind of cringe. Anyway, Safety is absence of catastrophic consequences. Integrity is absence of improper system alterations. Systems are supposed to be altered, but only by those who are authorized to do so. And can you fix it and maintain it? So if you look at security, we're going to talk here a little bit about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Well, two, integrity and availability also are part of dependability. Confidentiality really is not a dependability aspect. And so confidentiality, when you hear all the talk about privacy, Facebook privacy, all the things that are being aggregated, and how you penetrate privacy, it isn't necessarily undependable from the standpoint of cyber-physical systems and how they work. But having something available and having something to have integrity is both essential. So again, there's interactions. So loss of security can cause loss of dependability. So if you manipulate the control variables, like what Stuxnet did, where they started changing control variables, you could actually make the centrifuges undependable. If you mess with an infusion pump's settings, you can make it undependable. You can't depend on it to deliver drug at the rate that you expected. You can block ability to maintain. Loss of dependability can go to loss of security, and there is the certain aspects of dependability. Poor reliability causes maintenance that exposes. So one of the things you have to think about is if I send a maintenance tech out to a system and there is patient health, other kind of private data on that, does your service personnel have access to it? The Facebook thing that was discussed last week related to clear text passwords was not them doing something stupid as storing your password non-encrypted in a database. It was their logging system. It was as they logged login attempts, they were storing the password used on login in the logging server in clear text. So, oops, don't do that. We have requirements we deal with in the medical world, which is as we're doing logging, are we logging patient name? Does our logs become protected health information and therefore subject to confidentiality privacy laws in the case of that information versus, so because the personnel who maintain security logs may be different from the personnel who's dealing with the function of the device and its operations. So again, not thinking about those interactions leads to things like the Facebook exposure, and it's like, how in the world can that talk about it? As I told Brian, I had this slide. The last time I used some of these slides was to a talk to the Defense Intelligence Service, and there were people from the other CIA in the room. So I had to make sure I realized I wasn't talking about them. So the CIA triad is central to security talk. Integrity is absence of unauthorized system alterations. I have confidentiality as unauthorized disclosure, and readiness for correct services for authorized actions only. So again, authorized comes into all of these because the security overlay is who is authorized to change values, who is authorized to see the information, who is authorized to ask for the device to do something. So again, some examples of all of those in the medical device world. I got 3 eye charts coming up. I'm going to leave them up and blather on about something else while you have a chance to kind of read them rather than going through all these. But again, I think you're giving the slides out to the class. Yes, so we have the, but yes. So you can go and read all of these. But I just basically look at the what, why, where, when, and who of the 3 aspects of the CIA triad. And I think a lot is who would compromise. So confidentiality tends to be the property that those who want to monetize information go after. They're unauthorized to see information. They want to get access to it because that is more monetization. There are issues of reputation. So disgruntled employees can be a source, somebody else, a hacktivist that decides that you're working for a bad company or somebody that's doing something that's inappropriate may try to break confidentiality so that they can embarrass you. Certainly the Ashley Madison hack had a lot of reputational damage aspects to what they were attempting to do with that. So, and then nation states in certain nations are looking for intellectual property in order to, there's a closer relationship between the government and industry to build up, to steal intellectual property and create competing businesses in their country. So again, intellectual property then includes the confidentiality of the code that's in your device, because your intellectual property, when you are fielding a device out into somebody else's system, is embodied in the algorithms and the code that's inside your system. And if you haven't seen any YouTube videos or things related to people who can reverse engineer systems quickly, with that DARPA contract I was in, one of our demos was there's a type of attack called a ROP attack, reverse-oriented programming. And what they do is they exploit a buffer overflow to put a series of pointers on the stack and then get the system to execute a stack pop. And those pointers will point to you to a set of what's referred to in that vernacular gadgets. And a gadget is a sequence of code that does something you want, ending in a return. And so if you can get an entry point right before that code and doing enter return ROP. And so return-oriented programming is you're trying to find these places that are return, you create these gadgets, you string them together, and by pushing those on an overflowed stack and getting it to do it, you can get the code to execute a set of behaviors that it was not designed to do. There are people who reverse engineer x86 binary code and live in the binary world. This guy was using IDAPRO, which, as I was telling Brian this weekend, now has academic licensing for their tool, but it's one of the very sophisticated tools to lift binaries and analyze them for where data blocks are, where all the various other things are. He just started searching for, he knew the binary codes of what he was looking for, so he'd be searching for them, and basically interactive, well, as a demo, built a ROP attack in 15 minutes. And it was like, this was supposed to be a really, really sophisticated attack. The fun divergent story that I'll just, for those who are Simpsons fans, this guy worked for a company called Cromulence. And if you know Simpsons, the term cromulent was a Simpsons term, so I always thought it was ironic or fun that this company that he was working for named themselves after a fake Simpsons term. The guy had a mohawk, and his laptop had a sticker on it that said, "My other computer is your computer." So he was hardcore. So there are cryptographic code obfuscation techniques that can make instances. There's SLR, certain other kinds of techniques you can use for deploying code. So if you're in an environment where the intellectual property embodied in your code is important to your business, examine code obfuscation technique, cryptographic code obfuscation techniques necessary to protect the intellectual property. Integrity, again, in our world, therapy settings, it's like, does the pump at the right rate? Does the heart beat at the right rate? Does all these various different thresholds. The settings that a physician attends, based on the disease diagnostics, are important. It's like, are you taking the right dosage of your prescription? So settings of therapy systems, but because physicians tend to trust computers and the data they're given, if you can manipulate the diagnostic data to lead them to a bad decision, that can also be bad. So again, the things you need to do, and also a lot of deployment of asymmetric key cryptography in these systems, but if companies are sloppy about dropping hard-coded passwords in binary code, they probably haven't done a really good job about securing certificates and keys. So understanding TPMs and other kinds of hardware protection mechanisms for storing key management. Asymmetric cryptography is great. There's great libraries. It's all about the keys. So this starts being someone willing to risk patient harm, targeting whole product. Now when you're talking integrity, you're talking about messing up things that are directly related in our world to patients' health. So you can argue an integrity loss is also when ransomware encrypts all your data, you've basically lost the integrity of the data. So that would be an integrity attack. It's also an availability attack, since when it's in an encrypted state, you are unable to use it. So it becomes a deterrent. And this is one thing that in a traditional IT world, sometimes your best answer when you detect something is anomalous is to shut down. You know, don't stop doing it because being up puts you at risk. If medical devices are being used to support life, you're running a ventilator that's keeping a patient alive by pumping their lungs, shutting down is not a good answer. In an infusion pump, my colleagues I've talked to from companies that deal with that is, safe depends on what's it pumping. It may be that the best thing to do if you detect anomalies in a pump is to turn it off. But if that particular drug is really critical or there's really bad effects, if they're suddenly cut off a drug, which depends on the drug, it can be very drug dependent about what safe means. When I worked in the airplane world, safe was enough time to get it to the ground and land safely. So an example, I believe this was out at WannaCry when it came out, hit the UK first, and so there was a lot of the National Health Service in the UK that had some hospitals locked up. And a story that came through the grapevine on that one was a hospital who had a vulnerable MRI machine, and it got locked up by the ransomware. And a patient had just arrived in the ER having suffered a stroke. And MRI is one of the primary diagnostics tools to figure out how you should treat it. And they ended up having to chopper that patient to another hospital with a functioning MRI, which took time and introduced delay and speed. MRI and heart attacks are things, or strokes and heart attacks are things where response time matters. I never heard whether the outcome was bad or good after that story. It was just the example that the availability of equipment can affect patient health. And so thinking through what it means to respond to an attack, what things you do can be very much dependent on the clinical behavior of that device. So it's all about managing risk. And so after going into safety and security, we're going to talk about how do you assess risk. Again, I told you I was going to say 14971 more than once. 14971 defines risk as the combination of probability of occurrence and severity. And here's what Webster says about what risk is. Safety risk management, what this whole document of ISO 14971 defines a risk management process that talks about analysis, evaluation, introducing controls, reassessing analysis, ultimately evaluating residual risk reporting. And then the key aspect of all of that is, and once you're done, then you watch what you built, monitor it, and if you learn that there's something happening that doesn't fit what you thought it was supposed to do, you update and return and redo and lather, rinse, repeat. So the expectation is that you actually watch what you're doing. How many people think their Philips light bulb is being monitored for correct behavior? Probably less important, but still. We are computer controlling things that if somebody was able to go in and hack and shut all your lights off in certain circumstances and that type of stuff, people could fall downstairs. You could induce harm even from just the simple loss of the lights in an IoT system. So it requires risk ranking information. If you look at some of the government things, it's a process of identifying vulnerabilities. So what I'll point out in this one is, in both of these, you start talking about probabilities, and we'll talk a little bit later about how do you predict the likelihood of a hacker hacking. Well, some would say it's probability 1, but the reality is, to our earlier discussion, is they will try things, and if the first things don't work, they may move on. So it's what's the threshold of doing that is one of the key things you think about in designing systems to be secure enough. So again, I think we've talked through the way that you can get harm from security vulnerabilities, bad diagnosis, wrong patient, wrong side of the patient, which was a usability error that they dealt with. We'll talk a little bit about the interaction with usability here in just a little bit. So what we did in this Tier 57 I referred to that I had worked on as a committee chair was basically took the 1471 safety process that device manufacturers were intimately familiar with and cast security risk in the same structure, but then defined the steps using traditional security risk management approaches as drawn from standards out of NIST. So we broadened the definition of harm so that we tried to make sure that things like data breaches and that, if you are harmed, a person who's HIV positive that is trying to not have people know that and that gets exposed, that can cause them harm. It could cause them harm from a job perspective, although most of the protections are in place to stop that now, but still, there are things that people don't want known. So you could certainly broaden out and start saying that harm. We talk about loss of effectiveness. So if a hack even just introduces malware to compute Bitcoin on your device in order to use the horsepower, and now deadlines and things are being missed and the pump isn't pumping as fast as it should because it's too busy calculating Bitcoin, that would be a loss of effectiveness. You programmed it for X in the presence of malware, it's doing X, it's doing Y. The fact that those are not there could be a loss of effectiveness. And then privacy encryption kinds of things we did. The safety world, I tend to refer to the safety world as driving, looking in the rearview mirror. And you're driving forward looking at your past. Safety engineers are absolutely good at, and I was one of these and worked with some really talented statisticians, at collecting detailed data from the field, and they know exactly the probability distribution around failure of this kind of component, likelihood of this. And from that, you can look at aggregate probabilities of failure from a safety perspective. And so it tends to be very quantitative with backed up data. And the challenge always is, if you're in a safety world, trying to get them to think about security, is they'll look at the security statistics and say, we have no reported examples of this, so is the tail probability of it occurring in the future 0 because it's happened 0 in the past? And clearly these various examples tell us no, that it is, you can't do that. So you have to look at other surrogates for how you predict likelihood. Again, I'm going to give you a link later to some NIST documents, but NIST is free. NIST is a government agency designed to look at, and they have a series of security documents ostensibly geared to how you secure the federal infrastructure, Federal Information Processing, FIPS. But they are generically useful, so you will see things there on how do you secure Bluetooth systems, how do you secure mobile devices, how you deploy asymmetric key cryptography effectively, and that guidelines for that. So all available free online. NIST is your friend. In this special publication 800-30, which is on a security risk assessment, which we leveraged, this is one of 3 approaches they provide in there about how you come to overall risk. And by this one is where you look at threat sources and threat events as kind of a threat-oriented. You examine vulnerabilities, look at controls, figure out impacts. So basically, if I remember, it is identifying threats, vulnerabilities. So there are several different, there's also, and I don't have a slide on it here, but there's several threat modeling approaches. So Microsoft, the other M company, has a free tool for threat modeling that you can download. I don't think it works on a Mac. They are Microsoft. But it is, so Microsoft has actually gone from being in the doldrums of being recognized as terrible at security to recognizing that being secure was existential to their company. And they developed tools and mechanisms internally and then published them externally to try to help others also be secure. So they do a method called STRIDE, which is a risk analysis method. So look up Microsoft STRIDE method and look at that. You will see ways that you think about systems. And their threat modeling tool allows you to model components in your system and look at interfaces and reason about the STRIDE properties at these interfaces, and gives you, again, threat modeling is a tool to identify potential security risks so that you can make decisions about controls to insert into those. So they also publish a secure development lifecycle, SDLC, which defines the various steps during a development process. And they have a draft, they may be farther along on it now since the last time I looked at it, but they were looking at how to modify the SDLC for agile development. So again, interactive assessment, you look at the impact if the device loses the different properties, what's the impact? Again, what's, in our case for a medical device, we'll be looking at things like, if I lose confidentiality, am I going to lose patient protected data? Am I going to lose it for one patient, or am I going to lose it for 400,000 patients? Because the impact and breadth of it may be, you can control and manage a one patient loss. If a single device is stolen with a single patient, it's manageable. But, or if an attack has to get a hold of a physical device for each patient, that's a different kind of a risk level you're going to assess in terms of impact than a remote hack from some Russian crime organization can break in and download data for hundreds of thousands and put it on the internet, in terms of how you have to manage that risk. So again, impact is another part of it. And again, as I alluded to, security likelihood is, there's that original paper from 2008. Oh, here's Barnaby Jack. I forgot I had his photo. Here's the $20 bills spitting out on stage. So again, it's what's the likelihood that a researcher will decide to make a public display of the insecurity of your system for NBC News to see and put on their program on the national news at night? So if the attractiveness of your whole is that big, you should be thinking about the likelihood it is a much higher event than it's, you know, one patient's device in one thing that's really obscure. So again, it depends on what you're working on and what the exposure is. So I will again let you read some of these. We've got about 20 minutes left. I'm reasonable on time here, but again, quantitative versus qualitative, you're not going to get very quantitative in the risk management world. So we typically will have, and I think I have a chart here. This is the likelihood model that SP 100 talks about, but I think CVSS is, so I don't know if you're all familiar with CVSS, but it is the base scoring tool used, again, developed by MITRE. And so when you see CVEs published by US CERT, you will see a CVSS score associated with them. The CVS score ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being critical. They have a base metric, so sometimes you will just see the base score. Sometimes you will see it modified by temporal metrics or environmental metrics, but typically, and I think like last week's Medtronic publication, which came out in ICS CERT because of it, medical device, had a base metric of 9.3. So it was considered high. But so this has been kind of a standardized approach using the challenge we've wrestled with in the industry, in the medical device world, is it doesn't always take into account clinical behaviors and clinical things. You know, one of the things we know is, you know, nurses at the front lines working with patients are incredibly resilient people. And if they see something anomalous, they will probably just turn the thing off. So it isn't necessarily left free operating because they have enough skill. So understanding the impacts of clinical environment, which is really an environmental factor in this case, is something that there's actually a project going on to look at how you apply CVSS to medical clinical devices. So this is kind of more of the example of doing an index. So this is a safety index where, you know, an index of 1, a low impact would be discomfort, to high impact, potentially resulting in death, and some similar kind of things you apply in security. And so typically what these kind of methodologies do is they expect you to come up with definitions to say, how am I going to understand the impact of it? And then evaluate based on them and use what you said you were going to do. Sounds like get buy-in from the organization that you're all going to agree that this is what it is, and then apply them in a way that you can later go back and say, here's how I came. And then if you learn in operation in the field that one of your assumptions of where it fell and something is wrong, you got to update and maybe decide, that triggers it to decide whether you have to update, patch, make some change necessary for it. But it's not that you have to drive to zero risk. It's like you have to understand the risk, manage them to a reasonable level, and monitor to see whether or not your system is behaving correctly. Got a quick touch about how you loop in usability, because particularly in clinical systems, in aircraft systems, and as you saw with the whole Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines 737, this was an interaction with usability and understanding how the system works. So There's another standard 62366 that defines how you evaluate safety from a usability point of view. Do I make mistakes? And you can be harm to the user of it or harm to a patient. So it could be anywhere from electrical harm, things of that nature, but how you go about doing it. So here are some examples, and I think I talked about the ventilator turned off. So these are some of the trigger things that made people recognize that usability problems were a thing that needed to actually be formally assessed. So the ventilator example was when a ventilator is moving and you want to take an x-ray of a patient on a ventilator, you have two choices. You need to synchronize your x-ray machine to when you're at the peak or valley of a breath, so you have no motion happening. Or the old-fashioned way is you turn the ventilator off while you get the x-ray. And there have been too many examples where people forgot to turn the ventilator back on and patients died. We have had order entry system confusion. There was a order entry for pharmaceuticals, and the argument was it was a resident, and they were entering a prescription change for a patient on a floor, a critical patient, and they got a text message pop up on their phone. It was a remote mobile, and they got distracted and they didn't remember that they hadn't gone in and hit order, and the patient died. So understanding usability issues in any kind of safety, aircraft, industrial controls, nuclear power, electric grid control, medical devices, there's a lot of really interesting hard problems, but you have to think about the details of how they're being used and how these can interact with it. So really there was this push where there was how usability risks and safety related risks can intersect. We had similar kinds of experiences then of recognizing that security risks can impact safety. I've gone through several of those examples here. The reality is it's a balancing. I always refer to a three-legged stool where your safety risk, your security risk, and your usability, and you're going to want to balance it. Again, in a certain clinical environments, shutting the device off might not be the safe thing, so from usability. But if the security risk is coming from the network and the user is directly touching the device, are there situations where you might find it better to shut the network off and keep it locally controlled with very clear indication to the user that whatever functionality was network related is now turned off. So you start thinking about not just blanket I do things, but in the context of its usability, in context of achieving its safety, is availability a safety property? How do I manage the various different risks? And so I'm a system engineer by I said I'm a double E by education. I've evolved to a system engineer, and this is classic systems engineering, which I believe security engineering touches. It's thinking about the big picture and what's at the next level out. I'll be doing about 15 minutes. So, and getting on my system engineering soapbox, there is the concept of an emergent property. An emergent property of a system is a property that only appears when the system is connected together as a whole. You don't find that property in the individual components. And usability, safety, and security are all emergent properties of a system. And the thought of that one is you can construct a system where all the components are safe and the system collectively is not. 737 MAX 8. That is exactly what that system is. You can build something for where everything is unsafe and build a safe system. Fault-tolerant redundant systems will build by having 3 copies of something and voting it. Failure of one does not cause you to not get the right answer out from the other 2. So in fault-tolerant system design, it's really about assembling a safe, available system from unreliable failing components. So it's just recognizing, and one of the challenges then that we have in these kind of spaces is we build individual devices, but we put them into a hospital network where they interact with other systems, and you don't always control the end environment. So recognizing what you have, that what you control in security controls, what aspects you put in the individual device, what expectations you have about how that device is used in its operational context is all important about ensuring that the safety and security and usability of your device. My example from a usability perspective in terms of that is we have pretty good standards when it comes to our cars about how the interface is. So if you rent a car, it all operates pretty close. Dash lights, some of those things are a little bit different, but turn indicators, driving shift, steering wheel, all brakes, accelerator. Infusion pumps, every company's infusion pump has a totally different user interface with totally different things. And hospitals use infusion pumps for years and keep buying them, and they'll buy them from whatever contract they have. So sometimes a poor nurse is dealing with pumps that have different user interfaces. You may do all of the usability analysis on your pump that you want, and the confusion in the nurse, because they're mostly using another manufacturer's device. They use yours wrong, because that which was totally sensible to you and a user that was tested that was only trained on yours is very confusing when it comes in the context. So think about context. A few other things to think about. We at Boston Scientific have one of the things that my department is doing with Central Product Security is creating standard requirements. So we have kind of, we look through the security requirements that come from various standards, various hardening specs. We think about which ones make sense when it's an implantable device, which one when it's a ablation machine connected to a hospital network, which one when it's a home monitor, what's for a mobile app, and try to understand. So think about, and there are sources, and I will point to you some hardening specs and other sources for standard, use what other people have done, use them as sources of things for requirements, and understand what mechanisms should be there. One of the things that challenging in requirements world is it's fundamentally impossible to test a shall not. It's an infinite space. It's easy to you can test that something shall do this, but it's harder to do. And a lot of security world gets into, well, the device shall not. So what you need to do is more think about how you specify what should the device do when unallowed behavior is seen at the interface. So provide a proactive so that you can test for it and verify it. Look at abuse cases. Think of, similar to a use case, it's like, how would an abuser abuse the system? Think about the normal things that they would do. Talk to hackers. Read about what they do. Gary McGraw, who has written several textbooks in this space, really brilliant lecturer in there. One of the lectures I heard, he said, if there's 3 things that you should do to create a secure device, it's risk analysis, security analysis, threat modeling, getting your requirements driven through a proactive model and thought, architecture analysis, and code analysis, and security-based testing. So not just your standard testing, but security-based testing. So second aspect of this is architecture code analysis, understand what the model looks like, document how the security model is going to work, review it. So understand what existing exploits are there. Think about if a standard exploit was being applied against this system, would I tolerate it? We have authentication in real life. It's all these kind of things. Well, we'll have passwords change. This is the kind of suiting that a clinician needs to use if they're dealing with an Ebola patient. Does your equipment work when they're dressed up like that? Biometrics suck. Hard to get a fingerprint. Hard to do a retina. Hard to type a password. So, understanding some of those kinds of extremes of your use environment will help you decide whether or not your system actually works in its end environment. A lot of machine to machine. One of the things I keep talking about is very typical for an IT system for the user to log into a system and then be known to the network as the credentials of the user that logged into the device. If you end up in a surgical world where you're not requiring user authentication because of scrub up and that, you still have to think about how the device registers to the network. So thinking about machine-to-machine authentication and how do we recognize whether a device is a recognized legitimate device and how you control what a device has access to separate from the properties of what a user has access to. So again, in the cyber-physical world, device-to-device becomes a more typical model. I had referred to this earlier about this one. This is my, God, we love COTS off the shelf. Man, we love Windows operating systems. Manufacturers use standard operating systems because The talent is easy to hire. People can know it coming out of school. People know it, that type of stuff. It's potentially a skill they want in order to stay marketable. Its licensing costs are cheap. There's lots of available tools. But we know that a typical medical device will often be used 10 to 15 years. And Windows 7 is going off support in January, and everyone in the business is scrambling now with having just dealt with the Windows NT death issue way after it should have been. We're now facing the next one. So we've talked about in industry initiatives and from a research perspective and things, what are things that can be done? I know that the Boeing 777 I worked on 25 years ago did not have any of that kind of commercial off-the-shelf software on it, and they're flying successfully and safely today. So testing kind of falls into a couple of different areas. Fuzz testing, I don't know if you're familiar with the topic of fuzz testing, is basically came out of user interface design, but it's been applied a lot in protocol testing. So if I have a Bluetooth interface, and Bluetooth has certain rules about what a properly formed message should be, and you code those into your system, what happens if you get a message that doesn't meet those rules? The correct response is that your system should parse it correctly and reject it as a malformed packet. There have been medical devices who, if you just port scan them on a network, they crash because nobody thought about what was going to happen when why would you scan a medical device? They're safety critical. It's like, it's what IT people do. That's like how you figure out what's on your network as you scan. So fuzzing and protocol fuzzing can be a way to make sure that the implementation of standard protocols in your device behaves correctly to malformed behavior. And it's robust, and that's what's sometimes referred to as robustness testing. And penetration testing is really either internally or hiring externally somebody skilled in the arts of the hacker, looking at your device and attempting to hack in using their different tools to see if there's anything you might have missed. And again, Gary McGraw has a great chart I should have stolen from him with credit, which is that this is a badnessometer. It is, if you fail the test, you know you have a problem. If you pass them, all you know is you passed those tests. So unfortunately, it only gives you a sense of confidence, but it's not a proof. Testing will never prove. So other post-market stuff, if it's connectable, monitor vulnerabilities that are coming out. War games, I'm dating myself for those that are familiar with the, was it 84 movie about that? War games, shall we play a game? Called Global Thermonuclear War. But test it. We do war game. One of the things I'll be doing in San Diego next week is doing a war game with a national group on vulnerability. This is my links to that. But harden, it's disable unused ports. Don't turn off services your device doesn't need. Get rid of your test code. The St. Jude hack that happened in 2017 by MedSec, they found that they bought programmers from that company off the internet, off eBay, and they had been compiled with debug on, so when they pulled data off the hard drive of the programmer, a complete map of all of the read and write commands that protocol understood was available in debug tables that were parsable by it. It's like, just don't give your attacker a free guide by doing it. It's, all that stuff is stuff you do while you're in development, but think about that transition from the development software environment to my production software and what gets removed. What do I do? What do I do with obfuscation of that? The day before our Latitude system was going to have its home box, its original home box, go to production, we were doing some final testing, and I was doing some ad hoc testing. We had a Bluetooth link to a weight scale and blood pressure monitor for our system, and we were getting some weird behavior, and I went down with my thing I was testing to the lab, and I gave it to the engineer and said, something's misbehaved. I described it. He flipped it over, popped the serial cable on a pin block on the back, and a few keystroke, boom, all of a sudden he was logged into the Linux system that was underneath it to go and check some table. I said, what was the password you just logged in on? It turns out he logged in as root. And it was like, that's like within the first 3 guesses they would make. He said, well, you wouldn't have to guess because, you know, the first couple of hits on the carriage return was a baud rate lock on the serial port to tell you, and then the prompt that came up to prompt you for your username password in the prompt text told you you should use root. So I went upstairs as the lead system engineer and wrote a system change request on there to change that the night before it was. I was told that the first change they had originally thought about apparently involved some negative commentary on my genealogy. But anyway, it did finally get to be a rotating password in only certain blocks so that they had to know certain serial number ranges. So they fixed it, but it was like, you know, developers looking shortest path to testing don't think about it, so you've got to set those rules in. Anyway, there's a bunch out there. The military has the STIGs, CIS has a series of benchmarks, and I said NIST in those publications has guide for that. Use the hardening guide. Do the things that are supposed to be normal. I think we talked a little bit about logging. Let me get to just a couple minutes for questions at least. Configuration, configuration management, patching, intellectual property, worry about social engineering. So here's our conclusion. It's like, it's a constant balance. You got to think about environments if you're working in these kinds of spaces where the devices are being used for a lot longer than you might think they are. And what is the meaning of that? That said, I think there's a lot of interesting problems in this space. I've spent all my career, for the most part, except maybe the first couple of years of dabbling, that was space station stuff, and space shuttle. But all the stuff that I was doing has always been systems that if they don't work correctly, people die. And it's important work, it's interesting, it's satisfying. So with that, a couple of minutes for questions. I didn't bring more pictures of Brian, so you'll have to give me your email for that.
All right, I'll just open it up for questions at the moment. There's some great questions that I would love to hear answered, but any responses right off the bat?
Question.
Here.
I don't remember it, but I don't.
So, do you foresee medical hardware being implanted into the human body, or medical hardware fixing the human body from the outside? So, a cochlear implant versus laser eye therapy.
Well, I think both. There, I mean, the world's open. There's certainly a lot of learning happening with brain in terms of that, and there is. I saw there was a FDA just rejected the first therapy that was proposed. I mean, initial rejection doesn't mean that it's dead. It just isn't. It didn't meet its initial clinical goals related to a brain therapy for. I think it was to try to treat Alzheimer's, though I think it was not viewed. I mean, the data was. I think the summary I saw was that the clinical results were no better than what is known to be junk science. So you know, it's like it didn't work. So, but there are people doing research in terms of how you do that. Certainly a lot of things that are stimulatable. A lot of work. There was some interesting patents I just saw related to interesting ways to do body area networks so that you can communicate within the surface of the body or within the confines of the body without the energy leaking out, so you can maintain privacy and confidentiality if you wanted to communicate between wearables and implantables and things where you can, because there's, you know, obviously when you implant something in a device, it has a limited view. You know, they talk about 6-lead EKG, they put leads all over your body and they get a big huge view of what your heart is doing. When we put a pacemaker defibrillator in, we put a lead in and we're touching one point in the heart. I kind of view that as you're looking through a straw and you're extrapolating what you can, but you have to be minimally invasive because you can't wire that. So, you know, wearables. So I think the wearables world, the external treatment, the implantables world, there's going to be, you know, the future of the bionic $6 million man is still alive and well. Other questions? What were they?
I feel like an interesting one would be, what was your favorite thing that you invented, and what kind of software development should we get involved in if we want to get involved with developing medical devices?
So I mean, I hate to say this, but my coolest piece of equipment I worked on was the system for the Boeing 777 flight deck, an integrated system for multiprocessing in an ultra high availability world. So, so that was my first patents were in that work, and working on commercial airplanes is just like way cool stuff in terms of that type of thing. I was young, and I know I spent more time away from home in 1991 than I did at home, though Julie and our daughters, who are now grown, spent the winter in Phoenix with me. That wasn't an accident. So the ability to work with a really large team on a really hard problem that really mattered. It's like, as I was working on it, I said, I never want to tell my family they shouldn't fly in that airplane because I know too much about how it was designed. So my eldest has now taken a trip over to the Far East to visit a friend and flew on a 777. So, it's kind of cool knowing that that's safe. But in terms of the kind of software, I think my career has been around things that control the real world and deal with the real world. So I think a certain, understanding of real-time control systems, it's thinking about defensive programming, what happens when things go wrong, anticipating that kind of, developing a good paranoid personality. But it's like the world, Murphy causes all kinds of failures that you have to anticipate in terms of the operation of devices, but in the security world, Murphy is an active antagonist who's trying to get at you. So, I think the understanding good design techniques, software design techniques, understanding software architecture, really thinking through how something is structured in order to contain boundaries, a lot of compartmentalization in terms of software, in terms of those kinds of skill areas. Don't just build games. Mobile games. That fad will go away someday.
We're sure. Any final questions? All right, let's thank our speaker.
Thanks a lot.